The slap wasn't the mistake, it was the confession. James Patterson had just struck his pregnant wife Sophia in front of 15 investors. But what he'd really done was assault the hidden owner of Patterson Technologies without knowing it. Coffee dripped from his mistress Amanda's vintage Chanel jacket, but the stain was nothing compared to what James had just done to his future. Sophia had spent 18 months playing the role of supportive wife, while secretly controlling the billion-dollar conglomerate her husband worked so desperately to impress. But his hand connecting with her face had just ended the test, and his marriage. The investors gasped, but their shock wasn't about the domestic violence they'd witnessed. It was about what would happen when their mysterious CEO stopped pretending to be a victim. James turned back to his presentation, dismissing his wife with a wave, but he'd just made the costliest error of his life. Amanda's satisfied smirk widened as Sophia stumbled toward the door, but neither the mistress nor the husband understood that security cameras had been recording every moment for the Trillionaire's lawyers. The baby growing inside Sophia wasn't just an heir to wealth, but the future owner of the company James thought he was building. Sophia's trembling hand reached for the door handle, but instead of leaving, she pulled out her phone. Would the husband who'd chosen his mistress over his pregnant wife recognize his error when the truth emerged? Could 15 investors maintain their composure when the woman they'd watched being slapped revealed she'd been evaluating their judgment all along? And what would James do when Sophia's next move forced him to kneel before the wife he'd betrayed and beg for mercy he'd never shown her? 18 months earlier, Sophia Whitmore had made a decision that would either validate her faith in humanity or destroy it completely. Standing in her late father's corner office on the 72nd floor of Whitmore Global Industries, she'd stared at the wedding invitation on her desk, but the elegant calligraphy couldn't hide the doubts consuming her mind. James Patterson seemed perfect, Harvard-educated, charismatic, ambitious. But Sophia had watched too many fortune hunters circle her family's wealth like sharks sensing blood. Her father had died 6 months prior, but his final words still echoed in her memory. Test them, Sophia. Test everyone. People show you who they really are when they think you're powerless. The decision crystallized that afternoon. Sophia would hide her identity, but she'd do it so thoroughly that even the man she married wouldn't know he'd exchanged vows with one of America's youngest trillionaires. Her attorney, Margaret Chen, had argued against the plan, but Sophia's resolve was unshakable. If James loves me when I'm nobody, then I'll know it's real, she'd said, signing documents that transferred her visible assets into blind trusts while maintaining secret control through a labyrinth of shell corporations. Margaret had created an alter ego, Sophia Blake, an orphaned graphic designer with student loans and a modest apartment. But the truth remained locked in encrypted files only 3 people could access. James had met Sophia Blake at a charity art auction where she'd deliberately worn a dress from Target, but her knowledge of Renaissance paintings had captivated him. He'd pursued her with flowers and handwritten notes, but Sophia had watched carefully for signs of calculation. Their courtship unfolded in coffee shops instead of Michelin-starred restaurants, but James never complained. He'd proposed after 8 months with a ring that had cost him 2 months' salary, but the modest diamond meant more to Sophia than the 10-carat stone locked in her family vault. She'd said yes with tears streaming down her face. But even in that moment of joy, a small voice whispered, "Wait, watch, verify." The wedding was small, City Hall, 2 witnesses, a reception at an Italian restaurant where the wine cost $12 per glass. But James had smiled like he'd won the lottery. Sophia had worn her grandmother's altered wedding dress, but she'd left the Whitmore family tiara in storage. The marriage certificate read, Sophia Blake Patterson, but in boardrooms across 3 continents, executors still answered to Ms. Whitmore. James never questioned why his wife worked from home or why she occasionally took mysterious phone calls in another room, but Sophia had explained them away as freelance design consultations. He'd believed her completely, but that trust would become his undoing. 6 months into their marriage, James had launched Patterson Technologies with investors he'd courted for years. But what he didn't know was that Sophia had quietly purchased 40% of the company through a Cayman Islands subsidiary. She'd watched him build his dream, but she'd also noticed subtle changes. He worked later, but his shirt smelled like perfume that wasn't hers. He bought new clothes, but his salary didn't support the luxury brands appearing in their closet. He mentioned Amanda from investor relations frequently, but his descriptions focused more on her intelligence than was strictly professional. Sophia had hired a private investigator, but the photos that arrived confirmed what her instincts had screamed for months. The affair had been going on for 4 months when Sophia discovered she was pregnant, but James's reaction revealed everything. He'd smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. He'd talked about timing and career implications, but he'd never mentioned love or joy. He'd suggested she take it easy, but his real message was clear. Stay home, stay quiet, stay invisible. Amanda had been promoted to senior vice president that same week, but the announcement had included James's recommendation. Sophia had felt the baby move for the first time while reading that email, but her tears had been equal parts heartbreak and rage. The final test had been Sophia's idea, but Margaret had refined it into something devastating. Sophia would attend James's biggest investor presentation, the meeting that would determine Patterson Technology's future, but she'd play the role of dutiful wife, bringing her husband coffee. She'd observe how he treated her in front of the people whose opinions mattered to him, but she'd also see how Amanda behaved when she thought she'd won. Margaret had positioned it as an opportunity for redemption, but they'd both known the truth. James would fail. Men who stray didn't suddenly rediscover integrity in boardrooms. Now, standing outside conference room A, with 2 lattes and a cardboard carrier, Sophia felt the baby kick against her ribs, but she steadied her breathing. This was it, the moment that would determine whether her marriage had ever been real or if she'd been living a beautiful lie. The door opened, but Sophia's carefully neutral expression never wavered. The conference room smelled like leather and ambition, but Sophia detected something else beneath the polish. Amanda's signature Chanel No. 5 applied heavily enough to mark territory. 15 investors sat around the mahogany table, but their attention was fixed on James, who stood before a presentation screen displaying Patterson Technology's projected growth. His voice carried confidence and precision, but Sophia noticed how his eyes kept drifting to Amanda, who sat at the table's far end, taking notes with manicured fingers that had never known real work. The investors included pension fund managers, venture capitalists, and private equity sharks, but none of them glanced at the pregnant woman who'd slipped quietly through the door carrying coffee. James had been mid-sentence about quarterly projections when he noticed her, but his expression shifted from surprise to irritation in half a second. "Sophia, I told you I'd be home late," he said, his tone suggesting she'd committed a social violation, but he forced a smile for the investor's benefit. "Gentlemen, my wife, she means well." The dismissiveness in those 3 words cut deeper than any blade, but Sophia maintained her role perfectly. She moved toward the table, but her intention was simply to leave the coffee and exit as the dutiful spouse who knew her place. Amanda, however, had different plans. The mistress had been watching Sophia since she entered, but her expression held triumph rather than guilt. As Sophia approached to set the coffee carrier on a side table, Amanda shifted in her chair with calculated precision, but the movement appeared accidental. Her elbow connected with Sophia's arm at the exact moment the cups were being transferred, but the result was catastrophic. Hot coffee exploded across Amanda's cream-colored silk blouse and splattered onto her vintage Chanel jacket, the one James had bought her for their 6-month anniversary, though Sophia wasn't supposed to know that detail. Amanda's scream shattered the professional atmosphere, but her performance was Oscar-worthy. "My jacket! Do you have any idea what this cost?" She leaped from her chair, but her eyes held satisfaction rather than genuine distress. The investors froze, but their discomfort filled the room like toxic gas. James's face flushed crimson, but Sophia could see the calculation behind his anger. He was weighing his mistress's embarrassment against his wife's dignity, and the mistress was winning. "I'm so sorry, Sophia began, but James crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. His hand rose, but Sophia saw it coming in slow motion. The same hand that had slipped a wedding ring on her finger. The same hand that had rested on her belly feeling their baby kick. The same hand that had signed documents swearing to love and cherish her. The slap connected with her cheek, but the sound echoed like a gunshot in the marble-floored room. Sophia's head snapped to the side, but she didn't fall. She stood there, one hand instinctively protecting her pregnant belly, but her other hand rose to touch the burning skin where her husband's violence had branded her. "Are you incompetent?" James hissed, but his voice carried across the silent room. "Amanda is a senior executive of this company. That jacket costs more than you make in 6 months." The words were designed to humiliate, but they accomplished something else entirely. They revealed exactly how James Patterson valued the women in his life. The investors shifted uncomfortably, but several pulled out their phones, though Sophia couldn't tell if they were documenting the incident or simply avoiding eye contact. Amanda dabbed at her jacket with tissues, but her smirk was barely concealed. Sophia felt something crack inside her chest, but it wasn't her heart breaking. It was the last restraint on her anger shattering. 18 months of playing weak, of pretending to struggle financially, of watching her husband build his career on her secret money while courting his mistress with gifts Sophia's dividends had funded. It all crystallized in that moment. The baby kicked hard, but Sophia interpreted it as agreement. Enough was enough. Her hand trembled as she lowered it from her face, but when she looked at James, her eyes held something he'd never seen before. "I need to make a phone call," Sophia said quietly, but her voice carried steel underneath the softness. James waved her away dismissively, but he'd already turned back to his presentation. "Gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. As I was saying, Patterson Technologies is positioned for exponential growth." His voice faded as Sophia walked toward the door, but she didn't head for the exit. Instead, she moved to the corner of the room where her purse sat on a chair. Her phone emerged from her bag, but the number she dialed wasn't for a cab or a friend. Margaret Chen answered on the first ring, but she'd been waiting for this call for 18 months. "It's time," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Execute Protocol Whitmore. All of it." Margaret's response was immediate, but her tone held grim satisfaction. "Confirming full revelation, asset seizure, and legal action?" Sophia glanced at James, who was pointing at graphs while Amanda gazed at him adoringly. But neither of them had noticed that Sophia hadn't left. The investors, however, had begun whispering among themselves, but their attention kept returning to the pregnant woman in the corner. "Everything," Sophia confirmed. "And Margaret, make sure the cameras caught all of it." "Already done," her attorney replied. "The video is being uploaded to secure servers as we speak." "Sophia, are you absolutely certain? Once we start this, there's no going back." Sophia's free hand rested on her belly, but she thought about the child growing inside her. A child who would learn that dignity was non-negotiable and that power unused was power wasted. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she said, but her words carried finality. "Send the emails, all of them." Across town in offices Sophia had never visited as herself, but controlled through silent ownership, assistants began receiving urgent communications, but the content would reshape Patterson Technologies forever. The 15 investors in the conference room started receiving emails simultaneously, but James was too focused on his presentation to notice their expressions changing from discomfort to shock to something approaching horror. One investor, Richard Morrison from Apex Capital, cleared his throat loudly, but James ignored him. "Mr. Patterson," Morrison said more forcefully, but James held up a finger indicating he needed to finish his point. Morrison's phone buzzed again, but the message he read made his face go pale. He stood abruptly, but his movement finally got James's attention. "Richard, if you need to step out," James began, but Morrison's expression stopped him mid-sentence. "Mr. Patterson," Morrison said carefully, but his voice carried the weight of someone delivering catastrophic news. "I think you need to see this. We all need to see this." He held up his phone, but the email displayed bore a header that made James's blood run cold. "Whitmore Global Industries, urgent, ownership disclosure and executive misconduct investigation." James's confident smile faltered, but he tried to recover. "I'm not sure what this has to do with Patterson Technologies." "Everything," another investor interrupted, but her tone held accusation. "It has everything to do with Patterson Technologies and with that woman you just assaulted." All eyes turned to Sophia, who stood in the corner with her phone still in hand, But her expression had transformed from victim to something far more powerful. James's face went from confused to pale as the pieces began assembling in his mind. But the picture they formed was impossible. It had to be impossible. "Sophia," he said slowly, but his voice cracked on her name. "What did you do?" Sophia smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "I didn't do anything, James. I just stopped hiding." The silence in the conference room felt alive, but it carried the weight of 15 successful people realizing they'd witnessed something extraordinary and terrible. James stood frozen at the front of the room, but his presentation remote slipped from nerveless fingers and clattered onto the marble floor. Amanda had stopped dabbing at her jacket, but her expression shifted from smug satisfaction to creeping uncertainty. Sophia remained in the corner, but she was no longer the meek wife who'd entered with coffee. She stood straighter, her shoulders back, her chin lifted, and something in her bearing commanded attention in ways her modest dress never could. Richard Morrison was scrolling through his email, but each line he read seemed to drain more color from his face. "According to this disclosure from Whitmore Global's legal team," he said slowly, but his eyes kept returning to Sophia in disbelief, "Patterson Technologies has been majority-owned through shell corporations by Whitmore Global Industries for the past 18 months. The beneficial owner of those shares is—" He paused, but the pause stretched long enough that other investors began reading their own emails. "Sophia Whitmore," finished Jennifer Oakes from Sterling Ventures, but her voice held awe mixed with horror. "Formerly Sophia Blake, daughter of the late Robert Whitmore, current CEO and sole heir to Whitmore Global Industries, with a net worth estimated at—" She stopped reading, but the number was clearly staggering. James laughed, but the sound was hollow and desperate. "That's ridiculous. Sophia's a graphic designer. She lives in a one-bedroom apartment. She has student loans, for God's sake." His eyes found his wife, but he was searching for confirmation that this was all an elaborate mistake. "Tell them, Sophia. Tell them this is insane." Sophia tilted her head slightly, but her expression remained neutral. "I was a graphic designer when we met, James. That part was true. But the apartment, the student loans, the struggling artist persona, those were props in a very elaborate test." She pulled out the chair nearest to her and sat down, but the movement was graceful and controlled, like a queen taking her throne. "A test you just failed spectacularly." Amanda found her voice, but it came out shrill and defensive. "This is absurd. James, she's clearly having some kind of breakdown. Pregnant women get delusional." She turned to the investors, but her appeal died when she saw their expressions. They weren't looking at Sophia like she was crazy, but they were looking at Amanda and James like they were witnesses to a disaster. "Ms. Wade," Margaret Chen's voice cut through the room, but it came from the doorway where the attorney had materialized with two associates carrying boxes of documents. "I'd suggest you stop talking. Everything you've said in this room has been recorded, and given your role in orchestrating the confrontation that led to assault, you may want to consult legal counsel." Margaret crossed to Sophia, but she set a leather portfolio on the table in front of her client. "All the documentation you requested." Sophia opened the portfolio, but she didn't need to read the contents. She'd memorized every detail months ago. "James, do you remember when you started Patterson Technologies? You were so excited about your seed investors." She pulled out a document, but she held it up for the room to see. "Prometheus Ventures, which gave you $2 million. Prometheus is wholly owned by Whitmore Global. I gave you that money." James stumbled backward, but he caught himself on the edge of the presentation table. "No, that's not. They did due diligence. Background checks." "On James Patterson, entrepreneur," Sophia interrupted, but her voice remained calm. "Not on Sophia Blake, his wife. Why would they investigate the struggling artist who stayed home and made you dinner?" She pulled out another document. "Titan Capital, your Series A investors, also mine. Apex Holdings, which Richard represents, 40% Whitmore subsidiary. Sterling Ventures, Jennifer. Did you know that the anonymous institutional investor who insisted you back Patterson Technologies was actually me?" Jennifer Oakes looked like she might be sick, but she shook her head slowly. "The deal came through unusual channels, But the returns were supposed to be excellent. She stopped, but realization was dawning. You were testing us too, testing whether we'd enable someone like him. Everyone in this room was being evaluated, Sophia confirmed, but she stood slowly, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. I wanted to see who my husband really was when he thought I was powerless. I wanted to see which investors would tolerate abuse of a pregnant woman if it meant protecting their returns. I wanted to see if the woman he was sleeping with had any conscience at all. She looked directly at Amanda, but her gaze was ice. You all failed. James finally found anger through his shock, but it came out defensive and cruel. You manipulated me. You lied to me for 18 months. What kind of person does that? He pointed at her, but his hands shook. You're the villain here, Sophia. You're the one who played games with people's lives. I gave you every opportunity to be good, Sophia said quietly, but her words cut through his outburst. I loved you, James. I married you hoping you'd love me for who I was, not what I had. But you couldn't even be faithful when you thought I was nobody. Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied it. Do you know when I knew for certain? It was 3 months ago when I told you I was pregnant. You smiled, James, but your eyes calculated. You wondered if a baby would interfere with your career. You never once asked if I was happy or scared or excited. Amanda stood abruptly, but her chair scraped across the floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. I'm leaving. This is insane, and I won't be part of whatever sick game you're playing. She grabbed her stained jacket, but Margaret stepped into her path. Ms. Wade, you're named in several lawsuits being filed this afternoon, Margaret said pleasantly, but her tone carried steel. Conspiracy to defraud, interference with corporate governance, and, given that you deliberately caused the coffee spill that led to assault, you may face criminal charges as an accessory. I'd recommend you sit down and wait for building security to escort you properly. The color drained from Amanda's face, but she looked to James for support. James, however, was staring at Sophia like he was seeing her for the first time, but the recognition came too late. Sophia, please, he said, but his voice had shifted from anger to desperation. I made mistakes. I know I did. But we can fix this. We're married. We're having a baby. You hit me, Sophia said simply, but each word landed like a physical blow. In front of 15 people, you struck your pregnant wife to defend your mistress. And the truly sad part, James? I hoped you wouldn't. Even knowing about Amanda, even knowing you married me thinking I was poor, I still hoped that when tested, you'd choose kindness over cruelty. She closed the portfolio, but her movements were deliberate. You chose violence instead. Richard Morrison cleared his throat, but he looked at Sophia with something approaching respect mixed with fear. Ms. Whitmore, what happens now? To Patterson Technologies? To our investments? Sophia smiled, but it was the smile of someone holding all the cards in a poker game where everyone else had bet everything they owned. That depends entirely on how cooperative everyone is in the next few minutes. But I can guarantee one thing. James Patterson will never hold an executive position in any company I control. Not now. Not ever. James's knees buckled slightly, but he caught himself on the table. The reality was crashing over him in waves, but each wave pulled him further from shore. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed, including his marriage, had been built on his wife's hidden money, and he just destroyed the only person who could have forgiven him. What do you want? He whispered, but the question held despair rather than defiance. Sophia's expression softened slightly, but pity had replaced any trace of love. I want you to understand what you lost. I want you to feel what I felt watching you choose her over me, over us, over our child. I want you to know that the empire you thought you were building was never yours at all. She nodded to Margaret, but her attorney pulled out a thick document from one of the boxes. These are termination papers, Mr. Patterson. Effective immediately, you're removed as CEO of Patterson Technologies. The board, which Ms. Whitmore controls, has already voted unanimously in absentia. You'll receive severance as outlined in your employment contract, but all stock options are voided due to moral turpitude clauses. You're also being sued personally for assault. With this room full of witnesses, James's legs finally gave out completely, but he sank to his knees on the marble floor, where minutes ago he'd been presenting his vision of the future. His hands shook, but he looked up at Sophia with tears streaming down his face. "Please," he begged, but the word came out broken. "Please, Sophia. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Don't do this. I'll do anything." Sophia looked down at the man kneeling before her, but she felt no satisfaction, only profound sadness for what could have been. "You're not sorry you hurt me, James. You're sorry you got caught. There's a difference." She turned to the investors, but her voice carried authority that made billion-dollar deal-makers sit straighter. "This meeting is adjourned. My legal team will be in touch with each of you regarding your future involvement with companies in the Whitmore portfolio. How you conducted yourselves here today will factor significantly in those decisions." 6 weeks later, Sophia stood in her father's old office, her office now. But the autumn sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows felt different than it had 18 months ago. The city sprawled 72 floors below, but from this height, the people looked like ants navigating a concrete maze they'd never escape. Margaret sat across from her, but the attorney's expression held concern rather than triumph. On the desk between them lay a folder containing documents that would finalize everything. But Sophia's hand hesitated over the pen that would sign her name and seal James's fate permanently. "You don't have to go through with the criminal charges," Margaret said gently, but her tone suggested she thought Sophia should. "The civil suits have already destroyed his reputation. He'll never work in tech again." "The video of him slapping you went viral, 20 million views and counting. His LinkedIn profile has been deleted. Amanda Wade filed for bankruptcy last week. You've won, Sophia, completely and totally." Sophia's other hand rested on her belly, but the baby, now 7 months along, kicked as if offering an opinion. The ultrasound photos pinned to her bulletin board showed a girl, but Sophia had already chosen a name, Grace, after her grandmother, who'd taught her that strength and mercy weren't opposites. "Winning isn't supposed to feel this empty," Sophia said quietly, but she turned from the window to face Margaret. "I thought exposing James would bring closure. Instead, I just feel tired." Margaret leaned forward, but her eyes held understanding born from decades of high-stakes litigation. "Sophia, what he did wasn't just wrong, it was criminal assault. If you drop the charges, you're sending a message that wealthy men can hit their pregnant wives without consequences." She paused, but her next words carried weight. "Think about what Grace will ask you someday. Don't you want to tell her that you stood up for yourself? That you demanded accountability?" "I do," Sophia said, but she sank into her father's leather chair. Her chair now, though it still smelled faintly of his cologne. "But I also don't want her growing up knowing her father is in prison because of her mother's choices. James was wrong, Margaret, monstrously wrong, but he's also her father, and that matters." She picked up a photograph from her desk, but it showed her own parents on their wedding day, young, hopeful, uncomplicated by the wealth that would eventually define their lives. "My father told me to test people, but he never told me what to do when they failed." A knock on the door interrupted them, but Sophia's assistant poked her head in apologetically. "Ms. Whitmore, I know you said no interruptions, but there's someone here who's quite insistent. James Patterson. He says he has something you need to see." The assistant's expression made clear what she thought of James's presence in the building, but professionalism kept her tone neutral. Sophia and Margaret exchanged glances, but Sophia nodded slowly. "Send him in, but have security wait right outside." She stood, but she positioned herself behind her desk, a barrier between herself and the man who'd once shared her bed and her life. Margaret moved to the corner, but her phone was already recording discreetly. James entered looking nothing like the confident entrepreneur who'd commanded boardrooms 6 weeks ago, but the transformation was shocking. He'd lost weight, but his expensive suit hung on his frame like clothes borrowed from someone else's life. His hair was uncombed, but dark circles under his eyes suggested sleep had become a stranger. He carried a worn backpack, but his hands trembled as he clutched the straps. When he saw Sophia's pregnant silhouette against the window, he stopped, but his expression crumpled with something that looked like genuine remorse. "Thank you for seeing me," he said quietly, but he didn't come closer. "I wasn't sure you would." His eyes took in the office, the mahogany desk, the original Rothko on the wall, the view that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a year, but understanding finally settled over his features. This was always yours, all of it, and I was too blind to see it. What do you want, James? Sophia asked, but she kept her voice level and professional. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing how much his presence still affected her, but her heart hammered against her ribs in a rhythm that betrayed her composure. James set the backpack on the chair Margaret had vacated, but he unzipped it carefully. I spent the last 6 weeks doing something I should have done years ago. Getting help. Therapy, actually. Court mandated at first, but then... He pulled out a stack of notebooks, but they were filled with handwriting Sophia recognized as his. My therapist had me write letters. To you, to our baby, to the man I used to be before ambition poisoned everything good in my life. He held them out, but Sophia didn't move to take them. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, James continued, but his voice cracked with emotion. I know I don't deserve it. What I did to you was unforgivable, but I needed you to know that I understand now. You didn't manipulate me, Sophia. You gave me 18 months to prove I was worth loving, and I failed every single test. He set the notebooks on her desk, but his hands lingered on them briefly. I failed you. I failed our daughter. I failed the man I promised your father I'd be when I asked for his blessing after he died. Sophia's composure cracked slightly, but surprise showed through. You asked my father's blessing? He died before we met. She stopped, but realization dawned slowly. The cemetery. You said you were visiting your mentor's grave. I was, James admitted, but he pulled a photograph from his pocket, creased and worn from being carried. It showed James and Robert Whitmore at a tech conference, but her father's hand rested on James's shoulder in the way he'd once rested it on hers. Your father mentored me during my MBA program. When he got sick, I visited him every week. He talked about you constantly, but he never mentioned your name or showed me pictures. He just called you my brilliant daughter who's too trusting for this cruel world. James's tears fell freely now, but he made no effort to hide them. Before he died, I told him I'd met someone special. He made me promise that I'd love her for who she was, not what she could give me. I promised, Sophia. I promised your father, and then I broke that promise in the worst possible way. Margaret shifted in the corner, but even her professional skepticism seemed shaken by this revelation. Sophia sank back into her chair, but her mind was reeling. Her father had known James, had mentored him. The test she'd designed suddenly felt more complicated, but the threads of fate and intention had woven something she'd never anticipated. Why are you telling me this now? Sophia asked, but her voice was barely above a whisper. James wiped his eyes with his sleeve, but he met her gaze directly for the first time. Because you deserve the whole truth. Your father knew I was ambitious and sometimes ruthless, but he believed I could be better. He died hoping I would be, and for 18 months I had the chance to prove him right. His voice broke completely, but he forced the words out. I'm here to tell you that you should press charges. You should destroy me completely, Sophia, because what I did to you is exactly what your father feared I was capable of. And if there's no consequence, then his faith in humanity, in yours, dies with our marriage. The office fell silent, but the city noise 72 floors below seemed impossibly distant. Sophia's hand moved to the legal documents on her desk, but she looked at the pen that would either free James from criminal prosecution or condemn him to years in prison. The baby kicked hard, but Grace seemed to be demanding attention in the decision. Margaret, Sophia said finally, but she didn't take her eyes off James. Can you give us 10 minutes? Just 10 minutes. Margaret hesitated, but she gathered her things. I'll be right outside. If you need anything at all, press the intercom. She paused at the door, but she looked at James with an expression that promised consequences if he made any wrong moves. The door clicked shut, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Sophia stood slowly, but she moved around the desk until only 3 feet separated her from the man who'd been her husband, her betrayer, and now her father's protege. Did you love me, James? Ever? Or was I always just a means to an end? The question she'd been afraid to ask for 6 weeks finally escaped. but it hung in the air between them like a blade. James closed his eyes, but when he opened them, they held a clarity she'd never seen before. I loved you, Sophia. God help me, I loved you so much that it terrified me. But I also resented you. He laughed bitterly, but the sound held self-loathing. You were perfect, kind, talented, beautiful, supportive, everything I'd ever wanted. And some twisted part of me couldn't accept that someone that good would choose someone like me unless there was an angle. So I sabotaged it. I found Amanda. I let ambition override decency. I proved to myself that I was right to doubt your love by making myself unworthy of it. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me, Sophia said softly. But she felt tears forming in her own eyes. And it changes nothing, James. You still hit me. You still chose your mistress over your pregnant wife. You still valued a coffee-stained jacket over my dignity. She placed her hand on her belly, but she felt Grace moving beneath her palm. Our daughter will never see you raise your hand in anger. She'll never wonder if Daddy's love comes with conditions. She'll never sacrifice her truth to make a man feel powerful. James nodded, but he dropped to his knees for the second time. Though this time, the marble floor was replaced by expensive carpet, and his begging carried acceptance rather than desperation. Then send me to prison, Sophia. Let the world know that hitting your wife has consequences. Use me as an example. Let something good come from the worst thing I've ever done. He looked up at her, but his expression held something that might have been peace. Your father would want you to be strong. Grace needs to see you be strong. And maybe if there's any justice in this world, seeing you stand up for yourself will teach other men not to make my mistakes. Sophia looked down at him. But she wasn't seeing the broken man kneeling before her. She was seeing the 17 different futures branching from this moment. In some, she signed the papers and James went to prison. But Grace grew up visiting her father behind glass barriers. In others, she dropped the charges. But women everywhere wondered why wealth made justice optional. In still others, she found some middle path, but she couldn't yet see what that path looked like. Get up, James, she said finally, but her voice carried a strange mixture of sorrow and resolve. I need to think. I need to pray. I need to ask my daughter what kind of mother she wants me to be. She moved back to her desk, but she picked up the notebooks he'd brought. I'll read these. I'll consider everything you've said, but I'm not making this decision to punish you or to save you. I'm making it for Grace and for every woman who's ever loved someone who hurt her. James stood slowly, but he nodded. That's more than I deserve. Thank you, Sophia, for everything, for loving me when I didn't deserve it, for testing me even though I failed, for carrying our daughter even after I proved I'm not worthy of either of you. He moved toward the door, but he paused with his hand on the handle. If you decide to press charges, I won't fight it. I'll plead guilty. I'll take whatever sentence they give me. It won't undo what I did, but maybe it will prevent another man from making my mistakes. After he left, Sophia stood at the window again, but the city below seemed different now. Less like a maze and more like a tapestry of interconnected stories, each thread colored by choices and consequences. Margaret returned, but she didn't speak. She simply stood beside Sophia, waiting. My father was wrong about one thing, Sophia said quietly, but her hand rested on her belly where Grace was kicking like she was already ready to fight the world. He told me to test people, but he never told me that some tests don't have right answers, only choices we have to live with forever. Margaret put a gentle hand on Sophia's shoulder, but her voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd seen justice served and denied in equal measure. So what will you choose? Sophia looked at the pen on her desk, at the notebooks filled with James's confessions, at the ultrasound photo of the daughter who would inherit not just billions but the legacy of this moment. But she smiled, not with happiness, but with understanding. I'll choose what Grace needs, and maybe, just maybe, what the world needs too. The sun set over the city, but Sophia Whitmore, trillionaire, CEO, mother-to-be, and the woman who tested her husband's character only to discover her own strength, knew that some stories didn't end with clear victories or defeats. Some stories ended with choices that echoed through generations, teaching daughters that power without wisdom was tyranny, but mercy without accountability was enablement. Whatever she decided, Grace would know her mother had chosen carefully, deliberately, and with a love fierce enough to demand both justice and hope from a broken world.